1979, the year when British politics was transformed by the election of a new Prime Minister.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
The IRA that confronted Margaret Thatcher was fighting a long war to wear down Britain under a new generation of leaders like Gerry Adams. This is the story of how the IRA sustained its campaign through a constant search for arms and money, and found friends and allies all over the world.
I had not heard of Libya or its leader. It was quite a sensation at the time.
The IRA's Libyan link was a Catholic priest, identified by Mrs Thatcher as a key arms smuggler.
So when she linked you to Hyde Park, when she linked you to Brighton, she was right?
Absolutely, 100%.
But even as the IRA succeeded in gearing up for decades of war, its leadership opened up a new front for the Republican movement that would challenge its commitment to violence.
There was Adams, McGuinness. There'd no intention of continuing the war.
This is the story of how the IRA sought a political future in the shadow of the long war. This is the story of the gun and the ballot box.
Sligo in the west of Ireland. August 27th, 1979, a day like no other in the Northern Ireland conflict.
Lord Mountbatten's family set off from the jetty. 16 minutes later, it happened.
The Queen's cousin, Lord Louis Mountbatten, was killed by an IRA bomb alongside 3 others, including his 14-year-old grandson and another teenager. Several hours later in Northern Ireland, the IRA was leading British soldiers into a trap.
I was listening to everything, every radio transmission, and it became clear from a fairly early stage that there had been an explosion. And then you heard on the radio net the parachute regiment patrols being called and simply not answering. They weren't answering because they were dead.
As other troops moved in, a second bomb exploded. "18 soldiers were killed at Narrow Water near Warren Point. The Army's highest death toll in a single day throughout the Troubles.
You couldn't ask for a bigger disaster of a day. Lord Mountbatten killed on one side, 18 soldiers killed on the other side. This was a horrific day.
Lord Mountbatten was Britain, and Britain was Lord Mountbatten. We do feel very much about it, as we do about our servicemen.
Will you please stand still, and I will move.
2 days later, Mrs Thatcher made her first visit as Prime Minister to Northern Ireland. A visit that gave her a close-up view of the tensions at the heart of the conflict.
Mrs Thatcher! The nuclear block! We want this block wiped out! We don't have boys and girls out of this block! We want the freedom for our country! And you're soldiers out! And you're bringing us out!
That same day, Mrs Thatcher visited South Armagh, an IRA heartland on the border where the British Army believed the 2 bomb attacks were planned. Patrick Mercer was among those soldiers who met with the Prime Minister.
South Armagh was really difficult. These terrorists were dangerous, they were well motivated, they were very hard to penetrate, and they were quite brave, which again differentiated themselves from other bunches of terrorists.
Kieran Conway became the IRA's Director of Intelligence in the early 1970s.
South Armagh was the outstanding area, not just operationally, but in the support it could give to other units. They were never less than generous with their assistance. They just had that, ability to handle anything. They were outstanding.
With the murder of Lord Mountbatten, the IRA had struck at the heart of the British establishment. It prompted an immediate crisis for the Prime Minister.
I had no idea what pressure she was under about the death of a member of the royal family. Undoubtedly, that would have taken more of her time than the death of a number of soldiers.
Mrs Thatcher's immediate priority was the military defeat of the IRA. She wanted to deny the IRA what she saw as the safe haven of the Irish Republic.
This is narrow water where the bombs were detonated. And just over there is the Irish Republic, where the attack, like many by the IRA, was launched.
You have to remember, Margaret Thatcher really saw the whole question primarily in security terms. This, from the beginning, was her main concern, with security. And she felt, and she had good reason to feel, that we never got the wholehearted cooperation from the Irish authorities.
As far as we were concerned, we were dealing with a political issue. The government were dealing with a political issue. This was needed a political solution. While in Northern Ireland, they were looking at it as a security problem needing a security solution.
The IRA had announced its ambition and ability to the new Prime Minister in brutal terms. But the deadliness and sophistication of the organisation that killed Lord Mountbatten and 18 soldiers was a very long way from its origins in the early days of the Troubles. The burning of Catholic houses in Belfast in 1969, when residents were driven from their homes by loyalists.
The deaths and the fires were enough to drive dozens of Catholic families from their homes to the safety of refugee centres. But others had no choice but to go there.
It was a seminal moment at the outbreak of violence. The IRA faced demands to protect the nationalist community, but its access to weaponry was limited.
we very often find ourselves in a position where we might have had a weapon without ammunition, or we might have ammunition without a weapon. And very, very often we find ourselves in the position, if not always, that we had more volunteers than we had weapons to supply them with.
What few weapons the IRA could obtain were at constant risk of seizure by police and army. But coming of age was a new generation, determined never again to be without the means to defend their areas and take on the British Army. This is Gerry Adams with IRA man Brendan Hughes. In an interview to be kept secret until his death, Hughes said Adams sent him to New York in the early 1970s to smuggle back stocks of a rifle called the Armalite. The weapon of choice for the US military, it became a symbol of the IRA's armed campaign.
I think we did push the war forward more than anyone else did. And I think Gerry Adams was largely responsible for that, but it was because it was Gerry that sent me to America, right, to get Armalites.
Adams declined to comment or take part in this series. He has long denied being in the IRA and says Hughes told lies about him. America, where the Provisional IRA first looked to for money and guns.
The Irish diaspora has played an integral role in the direction of the Republican movement, which is why the influence of Irish America is central to the story of the Troubles.
The images of the violence in Northern Ireland resonated across Irish America. Irish Northern Aid, or NORAID, was set up to raise money for families of IRA prisoners.
Those even who put money in boxes on bars in the Bronx and in Boston and Chicago, you know, they weren't doing that to kill people. They were doing that out of a kind of a stupid, knee-jerk reaction, which was not intended to provide, you know, Armalites or to actually mow down innocent people.
But there's no doubt American dollars helped transform the IRA's arsenal. In 1972, the IRA hired an aircraft to deliver guns and even rockets as part of a secret mission. Money raised in America chartered the plane, but the weapons came from the North African dictatorship of Colonel Gaddafi's Libya.
This is a DC-3, the model of aircraft used by the IRA to fly a consignment of arms from Tripoli to Ireland in November 1972, and it was the first tangible indication of the scale of weaponry Gaddafi was willing to supply to the IRA. The DC-3 that the IRA used had to be stripped of its interior to accommodate 25 RPG rocket launchers and over 400 warheads.
This is the IRA's hired plane at Shannon Airport just after it was unloaded. Within days, its deadly cargo was used in attacks.
The shell ripped through the armour-plated window shields just as Constable Keyes reached the landing. He died instantly.
It looks at the moment as if they were all anti-tank projectiles of one sort or another. I think it represents a fairly serious escalation in weaponry.
It was quite a sensation at the time, 50 years ago, to find that we had friends in North Africa. It was an incredible development.
The Libyan regime maintained its links with the IRA through middlemen. The British government would come to believe that the most significant was this man, Patrick Ryan.
I was born in the year 1930, June the 6th, in Tipperary Down.
Once a missionary in East Africa, by the outbreak of the Troubles, Patrick Ryan was working as a parish priest.
I contributed financially a little, as much help as I could, some of it out of the mission boxes, to the situation up north. I was approached by some of the IRA leaders down here, if perchance I could work for them permanently. They asked me to travel the world and try to get help for them.
Libya's Colonel Gaddafi saw the IRA as comrades in arms fighting British imperialism. The link between his regime and the IRA was Patrick Ryan.
He was a fine fellow, one of the best I ever met, and we got on very well.
In 1973, the IRA sent Ryan on a mission to Rome.
I got a message from the RA to take myself to Italy, Rome. I would come in contact with a gentleman known as Joe Cahill. Joe Cahill and myself, taking a plane in Rome, we ended up in Tripoli.
Obviously,
Joe Cahill was then IRA Chief of Staff. Sentenced to hang in the 1940s for the murder of a policeman, he was reprieved and became one of the founders of the Provisional IRA.
What's going to happen to you now? You've given this, attended this press conference.
Well, I'll have to go deeper underground. I'll have to go deeper underground.
In Tripoli, Cahill and Ryan oversaw an IRA arms shipment on board the Claudia.
Initially, the boatload was destined to be about 200 tons. But shortly before I left Tripoli, I was informed that for reasons that they didn't explain, kept to themselves, they agreed to put on 5 tons.
The shipment had been betrayed. Some claimed that Cahill had ignored warnings that the boat's owner was working with British intelligence.
He was warned and warned and warned that the whole thing was gone, but still wouldn't listen. That's why they didn't get the 100 tons. The Libyans weren't prepared to lose 100 tons. They gave them a small shipment.
The Claudia arms shipment was intercepted off the southeast coast of Ireland.
But Ryan returned to Libya and would spend the next 10 years crossing Europe and North Africa, maintaining a network of arms and money for the IRA.
Paris was at the centre of Ryan's network.
The IRA also needed a constant flow of finance, and some of it was collected from Ryan's contacts here at the Libyan embassy in Paris.
Ryan deposited the cash in a Swiss bank account for use by the IRA.
I had this camper van that travelled all over Europe. Switzerland, Andorra, Monte Carlo, Luxembourg. If you arrived in at 50,000, nobody asked any questions. You're doing considerable business with the bank. You were exchanging rather unusual sums of money.
Ryan's supply line was transforming the IRA's war, helped also by an IRA man working on a car ferry between Ireland and France.
Sometimes I get a money transfer, and whenever I got that, then we have to get somebody to change it.
Did you have any idea of how much was in any of those transactions?
I would say there's probably about $250,000 in each one.
But Ryan's technical ingenuity was also delivering for the IRA.
I spotted these things, these little timers. It rang a little bell to remind you, you better get back to your car that your money had run out.
Memo park timers were used by motorists in Europe to remind them when their parking ran out. But Ryan realised they could solve a problem for the IRA, bombers being killed by their own devices.
So your debt is the last thing to connect. Your timer preset.
This was the most dangerous moment for IRA bomb makers. Many had been killed arming explosives.
Connect one end to the battery terminal.
Ryan's memo parks made the process more simple and effective.
I turned out a device that was foolproof against any Iran, and even if he tried, he couldn't kill himself planting a bomb. And that became extremely successful. Most of them never knew where it came from. They just took them and used them.
Ryan's timers were used in scores of bombs throughout the Troubles, including the Warren Point attack. But as the IRA's ability to wage war increased, some of its leadership were also looking to develop its political strategy.
Our organisation is very slow in involving itself in community affairs. And sometimes I think that perhaps we hope to free the people, whether they wish to be freed or not.
What no one foresaw was how a protest within the H blocks of the Maze prison would ignite the Republican political project. The government had stopped treating jailed Republicans as prisoners of war. In protest, cells were covered in excrement, blankets replaced prison uniform, and prisoners began to go on hunger strike.
That's what political status means. Special privileges for having done cold, callous, brutal murder.
On March 1st, 1981, a former IRA commander in the Maze jail, Bobby Sands refused food. With the wave of public support for Sands and others on hunger strike came a political opportunity for the Republican leadership. Sands was put forward as an independent candidate in a by-election in Fermanagh, South Tyrone.
I declare that Bobby Sands has been duly elected to serve as a member for the 3rd constituency.
The IRA prisoner and hunger striker was elected to Westminster and died on day 66 of his strike.
Three masked men stepped forward and obeyed orders in Irish to fire a 3-volley salute.
Tommy McKerney was among those in prison who took part in the hunger strikes.
It was certainly devastating. Bobby had spent almost 2 years in the same wing with me before that. I knew him. And then the other 9 today, many of whom I knew very, very well. It's one of the more difficult periods of my living memory.
10 men had starved to death before the protest ended. Margaret Thatcher became a figure of hate to Irish Republicans.
She had perhaps a sneaking admiration for the courage of the people who had been prepared to go the whole length. But her predominant feeling was she had been right, and so she would continue the very tough line she took.
Mrs Thatcher's stance enraged Republicans. But the Irish nationalist support it unleashed offered the movement a powerful new weapon: politics.
When Bobby Sands was elected, those within the movement who for long had been worried or sceptical or hesitant about engaging on an electoral strategy or any type of electoral strategy, here was clear evidence that there was a potential for success.
The hunger strikes had provided the Republican movement with an unprecedented level of popular support, a transformational moment in the conflict. Republicans would speak of seizing power with an Armalite in one hand and a ballot paper in the other.
But any move from a military to a political strategy risked splitting the IRA. The Provisional IRA had been born out of a Republican split over the balance between politics and the gun. At that time, Adams supported the gun. Those on the other side decided to follow a political strategy, abandoning the traditional Republican policy of abstentionism in order to be able to take seats in the Irish Parliament, the Dáil. The split led to a deadly feud.
For the past 2 weeks, hardly a day has gone by without a funeral as a result of the Republican feud.
The danger of the new emphasis on politics in the wake of the hunger strikes, even though the armed campaign continued, was that it had the potential to again divide the movement.
I believed that eventually there had to be a conflict of interest between a political electoral strategy and an armed campaign. It's not possible to run a parliamentary campaign while attempting to overthrow the same state that you're hoping to manage.
How are you? Are you canvassing for the election?
Yes, I'm voting for you, don't worry.
No problem.
But for most Republicans at the time, politics was merely a tactic. The armed struggle was supreme, and American Armalites as important as ever.
It's this place that's so important for the IRA in its search for weapons and money to fight its war.
The IRA's #1 man in America was George Harrison.
George Harrison was a man in his mid-60s. He had been born in Ireland, County Mayo, and he had immigrated to the United States in the late 1930s. He was unmarried, he lived with his sister, and he was really married to the cause of Irish freedom.
Harrison hosted secret trips by IRA leaders, including Martin McGuinness, underlining his importance.
Met Martin McGuinness here. It would have been in the late 70s. I know he had been staying at George Harrison's house. I certainly have my own speculation why he was staying
What's
where
your
he was,
speculation?
but you know, I'll let you draw your own conclusion.
This is George Harrison, leaving a deal to purchase arms for the IRA. He doesn't know that the man behind him is an FBI agent.
I was the undercover, the person selling guns to the IRA.
This is one of a series of covert photographs shown for the first time, taken on the FBI operation that broke up the IRA's main gun-running network in America from the inside. Brooklyn, New York City. Harrison's home here became the focus of the sting.
The FBI went undercover here in Brooklyn and wiretapped the heart of the IRA operation.
The first meeting we had with George Harrison, we had 2 Ruger Mini 14 rifles with scopes, and we had put a tracking device in the stock of one of the Mini 14s. I was wired up, recorded the conversation, and then George was looking for 20mm cannon ammunition. They wanted something to bring down helicopters, and that was what they thought they would use the 20mm cannon for. I left. We had 24-hour surveillance on that rifle with the beeper, the tracking device.
But in a moment of panic, the FBI suspected the weapons were being moved and arrested Harrison. With Harrison in custody, FBI raids uncovered a huge IRA stockpile of weapons.
We had a flamethrower, the 20mm cannon ammunition, plenty of rounds of ammunition.
A number of IRA members were swept up in the operation. Among them a former Chief of Staff, Joe Cahill, at large once again following his arrest on board the Claudia.
He used to wear wigs, and he'd take the wig off and then say, "Ha-ha, you didn't know it was me," to different people. So, and I know he stayed with George Harrison also.
We had information that he was going to be at a NORAID fundraiser. I ran up and shouted, "Hey, Joe!" And he turned around, big grin on his face. He said, "FBI, you're under arrest."
The FBI sting also brought in the founder of NORAID, Michael Flannery.
He was the money man for George Harrison, for the shipment that we arrested them all on.
The trial showed how the strength of feeling unleashed by the hunger strikes had spread across the Atlantic to the American public.
Harrison's lawyer's opening statement was, the United States government accuses my client of running guns to the Irish Republican Army for 9 months in this indictment. It's a bloody lie, and they know it. He's been doing it for 35 years, and we have the records to prove it, and slams them on the table. And that's when I think everyone knew this one was going to be different, because it wasn't an admission, it was beyond an admission.
The defence painted the men as freedom fighters, resisting British oppression, even claiming their arms supplier was a CIA agent. As such, they were working on US government business.
We thought it was preposterous that the judge would allow it. It turned it into a gun-running case, into a political trial, put the government of England on trial.
And they came in and announced, not guilty, and not guilty, and not guilty, and not guilty, and not guilty. I don't have a better word for it. It went wild. The Irish court clerk from one of the judges stood up in the back with his fists in the air yelling, IRA, IRA, all the way, until someone came and pulled him out, reminding him that he worked for the system. And of course, the aisles were blocked and everybody's fighting their way up and down. And in the middle of everything, George says, I want my guns back. The first time Irishmen have been acquitted of gun running, and it's also the first time they've said, well, yeah, we did it, and we're proud of it.
The FBI had closed an IRA arms network, but in the process highlighted the extent of support in Irish America for the IRA, which was continuing its war with brutal effect.
Between 5 and 10 pounds of plastic explosives had been hidden in a blue Austin car. The blast started a day of carnage and confusion in London.
The IRA stepped up a campaign of high-profile, multiple casualty attacks, including the killing of 4 soldiers in the Hyde Park bombing in 1982. In fact, the switch used to detonate the attack had been supplied by the IRA's Libyan link, Patrick Ryan. Mrs Thatcher's government was re-elected in 1983. And in a stunning development, Gerry Adams was also elected as the MP for West Belfast. Though in keeping with the policy of abstentionism, he refused to take his seat.
Do you not think that for the Republican movement, perhaps the way forward now should be the ballot box, should be constitutional politics?
That's a question that has to be put to the British government. If they listen to the ballot box, then no one would be reaching out for an armament.
Even as Adams celebrated political victory, the IRA was rebuilding its American arms network.
I grew up with Irish parents. All our friends were Irish. Everybody who was at the house was Irish. And I always heard Ireland referred to as home. People always talked about going home.
New York-born John Crawley left the US Marines to join the IRA. He was ordered to set up a new IRA arms network in America.
I wasn't given any advice on anything to get. Just get weapons.
Crawley's gun-running network took root in Boston.
I was given a $5 note that was cut in an erratic way, and I was to meet somebody in Boston who had the other side, half of this note.
The torn $5 bill led to Pat Nee, an IRA arms supplier and a leading member of the South Boston mob. Nee was an associate of the infamous Boston gangster James Whitey Bulger.
The joke around here was when Whitey walked into a bar, all the beer went flat. You know, he had that type of effect on things. It was just, there was no joy in the man. That's what I'm trying to say.
Gloucester, northeast of Boston. It was from here that the IRA would launch a major operation to transport arms across the Atlantic.
Total cost was in the 1.2 million over a 2-year period. The boat being the most expensive, I think that cost 400,000. Fishing boats are expensive.
Where was the money coming from?
Local criminals who were persuaded to donate, to be our friends, you know.
In autumn 1984, the weapons were delivered to this dock in Gloucester for shipment to Ireland.
The cargo of guns and ammunition was loaded onto the boat in the hours of darkness. It took about an hour and the gang was under pressure to get the 7-ton arsenal in situ without raising any suspicions.
Boston crime boss Whitey Bulger was parked up nearby and used a radio scanner to check police calls as the boat was loaded.
We'd spend the night loading it, storing it below decks, and they left in the morning.
We boarded the boat and we went through the harbour, and then I remember when we left the harbour and just hit the first swell of the Atlantic, which wasn't much, and it was quite for that boat, and I remember thinking, this will be interesting.
So the water in Gloucester Harbour today is relatively calm, but once you go past the breakwater, that brings you out into the wilds of the Atlantic. They, of course, travelled on 3,000 miles towards the Porcupine Basin. That's off the County Kerry coast.
But the IRA was sailing into a trap. An IRA informer working for the Irish police had betrayed the operation. The RAF tracked the boat. This image was taken of the boat at sea, and transcripts we've obtained reveal its radio transmissions were also monitored. After the weapons were transferred to an Irish trawler, the shipment was intercepted by the Irish Navy.
This was the lethal cargo which would apparently have ended up in the hands of the IRA. More than 100 American Armalite rifles, light and heavy submachine guns, grenades and ammunition.
The IRA had suffered a significant setback. But less than 2 weeks later, it struck back.
The explosion came just before 3 o'clock. Most of the residents were asleep. Some were still socializing in the bars as the hotel was ripped apart.
The Brighton bomb of 1984 was a direct attack on Mrs Thatcher and her cabinet.
And I just turned to do one final paper, and then it went off. My husband was in bed, and all the windows went, and the bathroom was extremely badly damaged.
In your own room?
Yes,
your room?
Yes,
I think that's enough.
we were very lucky.
The bomb killed 5 and injured many more, including senior cabinet member Norman Tebbit and his wife, who was left paralysed.
She was transformed that night. I could never forget that she was wheelchair bound and extremely severely disabled. I know it brings a tinge of joy to some people who still crave for the old ways of violence, but there we are.
Recovered from the rubble were fragments of a Memo Park timer, of the type supplied to the IRA by Patrick Ryan. The extent of Ryan's role with the IRA was later revealed in a record of discussions between the Prime Minister and the Irish Taoiseach.
These papers reveal how Thatcher considered Patrick Ryan to be the main channel of contact between the IRA and Libya for over a decade. She describes him here as a very dangerous man with an expert knowledge of bombing. To go back to what Thatcher had accused you of being involved in, were you involved in any of the incidents that
I would say most of them. One way or another, yes, I had a hand in most of them. Yes, she was right.
So when she linked you to Hyde Park, to Brighton, she was right?
Absolutely, 100%. Oh, yes.
And now, when you look back, do you have any regrets?
Oh, I have, yes, big regrets. Of what nature? I regret that I wasn't even more effective. Oh, yes, absolutely. I'd like to have been much more effective than I actually was, but we didn't do too badly, no.
The IRA's violence did not stop Sinn Féin making gains in the 1985 council elections. But a show of unity hid division. That month, the IRA expelled several senior members who claimed that funds were being diverted from the IRA's war into politics. Any suggestion the IRA would be eclipsed by politics was banished by the leadership.
We don't believe that winning elections and winning any amount of votes will bring freedom in Ireland. At the end of the day, it will be the cutting edge of the IRA which will bring freedom.
Nowhere was the so-called cutting edge of the IRA more evident than along the border.
The IRA dominated South Armagh. What the British termed bandit country was in effect the IRA's killing fields.
As the political strategy gained ground, military hardliners could draw reassurance from plans to put the IRA's war on a new footing.
You would be told during meetings stuff is on the way. Okay, it's in the pipeline. We have contacts. The stuff will be here, good stuff. Surface-to-air missiles, rocket launchers, the Semtex explosive, proper military explosives, new rifles, everything, heavy machine guns, the lot. It was very tight. It was run from South Armagh.
The arms came into Ireland just as the London and Dublin governments were stepping up their fight against the IRA. The Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985 offered greater security cooperation and a role for the Irish government in Northern Ireland.
We entered into this agreement to defeat the men of violence and to bring peace and stability. We enter into this agreement in good faith.
The agreement's Irish dimension was aimed at countering IRA support. It was seen as a victory for John Hume, the moderate nationalist leader who had long argued for a role for the Irish government in Northern Ireland.
I remember the day that it was signed. I scripted the few words for the Taoiseach to say to the nationalist people in the Northern Ireland, inviting them to lift up their heads. Everything had changed, and it had.
Nationalists can now raise their heads, knowing that their position is and is seen to be on an equal footing with that of members of the Unionist community.
Within weeks, apparent security success. Irish authorities uncovered a huge stockpile of arms, but had only actually scratched the surface.
By the end of 1986, some 120 tons of a Libyan-supplied arsenal was buried in bunkers across the Republic. The IRA had enough material to continue its armed campaign indefinitely.
This was the very moment that Gerry Adams and his supporters felt strong enough to break the core Irish Republican principle of abstaining from the Irish Parliament.
After the partition of Ireland, Republicans boycotted the Parliament here in Dublin, claiming that the Dáil was illegitimate. But in October 1986, the IRA called a General Army Convention, the supreme authority of the IRA, which it described as historic. Those present were told that weapons were en route, and the leadership asked delegates to advocate the taking of parliamentary seats in Dublin. The IRA approved the monumental shift.
I was there. It was a cinema, a smallish country cinema, and there was plenty of room for, I think there's maybe 70 people there. Now, there were complaints afterwards that people had not been picked up. I believe that's probably true, that the numbers are manipulated to give the yes side a majority.
By the time of Sinn Féin's annual convention weeks later, it was clear the movement would support the political direction of Adams and others.
We have been down the road of feuding before. We are not going down that road again.
But some older Republicans, including veteran IRA leader Rory O'Brody, left, fearing the military campaign was being run down.
We were called to a meeting during that hot dish at lunchtime on the Saturday, and they said they began lecturing us. There was Adams, McGuinness, and the Chief of Staff, and they were there to lecture us. And by Jesus, we told them to F off at that time. We were not accepting it. They were going to continue the war. No, they wouldn't continue the war. They had no intention of continuing the war.
I think there was a major contradiction between looking for parliamentary seats and fighting a war. If you're really smart and Machiavellian, as some are, you might say, well, allow this contradiction to play out and it will increase the appetite for peace talks, as did indeed happen.
In fact, months before, Gerry Adams had already started to secretly explore a political resolution to the IRA's campaign.
I have the highest respect for your ideas and everything else, because you're a man of peace.
In May 1986, Adams approached the nationalist leader John Hume through priests in this Belfast monastery. We've obtained a remarkable letter from the priests to John Hume saying Adams was offering direct dialogue, which they believed would lead to a political alternative to the armed struggle. In effect, what Adams' internal opponents had feared, the ballot box taking over entirely from the Armalite. In late 1987, the scale of Libyan aid to the IRA was revealed.
The French authorities found 20 SAM missiles in the cargo, several thousand Kalashnikov rifles and 10 tons of shells, among other things.
Also on board, Semtex, a powerful plastic explosive. And the authorities soon learned that 4 other Libyan arms shipments had made it through.
This was a major intelligence failure. These were 4 large shipments of weapons that came into our republic, to one of our ports, transported within our country, hidden within our country, and then transported to Northern Ireland.
A week later, the IRA used Libyan Semtex to brutal effect. The Enniskillen bomb on Remembrance Sunday killed 11 civilians. The attack prompted widespread revulsion. Gerry Adams later issued a rare statement of regret over the bombing. The Republican leadership was acutely aware of how IRA atrocities, and in particular the killing of civilians, could affect its own political ambitions. Adams was presiding over an historic shift in IRA strategy, away from the supremacy of armed struggle. With its armories full of Semtex, the Republican movement was beginning, secretly and painfully slowly, to step back from blood, away from the Armalite and to the ballot box.
And the series continues, same time, 9 o'clock next Tuesday.